Peter never got a chance to prep these movies.
I can't say that.
But he didn't.
I think the most important things to remember when discussing the Hobbit films compared to the books is that Peter Jackson originally didn't want to direct these. In fact, he was kind of thrown into it running, as it were.
And then because Guillermo del Toro had to leave and I sort of jumped in and took over, we didn't wind the clock back a year and a half and give me a year and a half prep to design the movie I was going to make, which was different to what he was doing.
And the other thing to remember is that when it comes to Tolkien's works, the fans are ridiculously diehard about the letter of the law. But there is some grace to be given. Peter Jackson was thrown into it while it was already in production, and so there were some limitations set forth in front of him. So the question here today is, why is the adaptation so bad? Or I guess, is the adaptation so bad? Is the first one to ask. And in all honesty, it is. They're not good films regardless of how well they were adapted from the books. They're just not very good, and I personally really didn't enjoy watching any of them. I think there's some main reasons as to why these ended up not working out super well. Outside of Peter Jackson not being the original director for this, that is definitely a stumbling block for him, but ultimately not the end-all be-all of what makes a movie good or not. Now, it's not the worst movie adaptation. I would say it's definitely top 3, but it's not the worst, especially when you have things like this.
It's got rockets, man!
Well, it's definitely not that. And when it comes to The Hobbit, I think there are several key reasons as to why this truly didn't just work out as well as The Lord of the Rings, and we'll have some comparisons here. But I think the first one is kind of a money grab. When you compare the two trilogies to each other, The Lord of the Rings was more of somebody wanting to bring this into the movie industry and do the best that they possibly could, whereas when it comes to The Hobbit, it was definitely more of a money grab. It was just people trying to play off the already highly successful franchise to make another trilogy, and I think that was honestly the wrong foot to start off on altogether, is wanting to make money off of it. When it comes to Tolkien as a whole, I don't care what you want to do with other movies. If your entire plan is to make money off this film, by all means do it. When it comes to Tolkien's work, if you want it to succeed and if you want the fans to receive it well, your motivations cannot be money. If they're money driven, it's just not going to work out.
We had there was a lot of discussion obviously about how long the film has to be, and I obviously believe ultimately that films should be as long as they need to be, because a film is something that you just have to feel your way through it as you're cutting it.
And I think that really shows in both trilogies. In The Lord of the Rings, the original trilogy, it's so evident that Peter Jackson and everybody involved, their entire heart and desire is to put Tolkien's work on the screen and to do the best possible job that they could, whereas when it came to The Hobbit, it wasn't so much about presenting the Hobbit book on film as best as possible. It was more of, how do we make big bucks off of an already established franchise that hasn't been done yet? And I honestly think this shows throughout the entire film with all the decisions. I mean, the first big decision being that it was made into a trilogy when there really isn't 3 movies worth of content in this book. It's definitely 2 at the most, or a really long 1 movie. I think it makes sense to do it 2 because then you have some extra time to put in all the appendices that you want to do to make it make more sense for those watching the film. The greed of those making this movie, I think, is very evident in the decisions that they made throughout, especially when it came to trying to foreshadow The Lord of the Rings and the overall air/feel of the movies, that they made it out to be more of a prequel than an actual standalone book. And so they attempted to make it feel like The Lord of the Rings, when in reality, if you've read the books, they're nothing like each other.
I didn't want to make a children's film per se, but at the same time I wanted to have it more comedic than The Lord of the Rings. And be able to sort of capture something of the flavour, but also feel like we had a foot in the Lord of the Rings door as well. So the same filmmakers are making another Middle-earth story in much the same style.
And I can understand wanting to have nods to the future, but introducing whole characters that don't need to be there, like Legolas, it seems like a bit of a stretch to me. And this brings me to the second point that I had, that honestly is the most important point, and without this, you're kind of losing everything, no matter how much effort and how good intentions you have, is the feel of the movies.
Did you have some kind of mechanism, in a sense, so that you could make sure that you were true to Tolkien?
Well, we didn't want to put any of our own, certainly in terms of the thematic material, we didn't want to put any of our own baggage. I mean, we had no interest in putting our messages into this movie, but we thought that we should honour Tolkien by putting his messages into it. And we thought he cared about things. The countryside and the rise of evil, and he cared passionately about certain issues. And we thought what we should do to honour him is to make sure that what he cared about ends up in the movie. That's what we tried to do.
When you're looking at The Lord of the Rings compared to The Hobbit, yes, things got changed similarly. The books compared to the movies are not identical. That is not what I'm saying here. But when you look at the decisions that were made, they weren't made because they wanted to change something. They were made because they needed to change something to make it relay correctly on screen. They weren't making decisions haphazardly. It was so that they could relay the emotions, the feelings, the feel of the book into the films.
He was an Oxford professor who dedicated his life to a love of mythology, ancient mythology, which is not fantasy. It's very different. Mythology is different to fantasy. And Tolkien always mourned the fact that England's mythology had been eradicated by the Norman invasion in 1066. And so England's mythology was like medieval stuff like Robin Hood and King Arthur. I mean, it didn't go any further back than that. So Tolkien thought he wanted to create a mythology for his country, for England. And this is what he did. He spent his lifetime doing the stories of Middle-earth and the saga, and the history of the mythology, the concept, because he said, I imagine this took place in England and Europe some 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. And so we thought, okay, so what we'll do with the movie is we will pretend that this is history, just as if we were making an ancient Roman film or making Braveheart, about Sir William Wallace, that we'll pretend that these guys existed. It's history. It was real. That let's make the movie with that weight of authenticity in the designs, the look, the performances, everything. So that was our mantra.
When you look at The Hobbit and the decisions that they made on the changes from the books to the movie, it has nothing to do with the cinematography of it. It was purely their decisions to make these changes, not following along with the way the book feels. And I think that tends to give it a totally different air, which I think is what they were going for, and that was one of the bigger problems.
We are fans of the books ourselves, and so you're always, you can't ever faithfully adapt a book in the sense of just every line of dialogue and every scene is exactly the same. But you do try to take care of those iconic moments, the moments where, as a reader of the book and a fan of The Hobbit, you expect things that you expect to see in the movie. You try to have all those moments in there.
When it comes to writers, especially Tolkien, he chooses every single word very intentionally, and when you have to change it for the screen, I can understand that. I, for one, understand changing things for the screen experience. I get it. Movies can't be exactly the same. Your time constraints, you've got visual effect constraints, all of that makes sense. But it is in the decisions of what to change that make the difference between the books and the movies. If you're changing it just because it's easier to change or that's what you want to do, that is not the way to go about things. If you're changing it because it has to be changed, if you only approach that with, well, we got to change it, so we're just going to change it, that's a poor way. You have to look at it as, how do we get across the emotion and the feeling of this scene so that it translates on screen as the way it was in the book.
I wish none of this had happened.
So do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. There are other forces at work in this world, Frodo, besides the will of evil.
A lot of the decisions they made in The Hobbit totally changes the feel of Bilbo and his motivations throughout the movies as compared to the book. Now, there are decisions that they did make that make sense. There are a lot that made no sense. And that really all comes down to effort on how much you want to put into this to make it feel like the original, which takes more effort because you have to be super, super creative in order to convey the same thing as the book, but in different style for the movie. And that's kind of the third point when it comes down to it, and I'm not entirely blaming Peter Jackson for this, but it's the effort put into these films. When you look at the story of The Lord of the Rings and the effort and time put into these films, the assets and everything laid down on the line to make those films succeed, it's no wonder that they had so many nominations and won so many awards. The pure amount of effort put into making armor and miniatures and avoiding CGI where they could to make things feel as realistic as possible is above and beyond when it comes to Lord of the Rings. Unfortunately, that did not translate when it came to The Hobbit. Way more CGI was used, less effort as a whole seemed to be put in, and you can really get that feeling from the actors. When you're watching the Lord of the Rings films, you get the feeling from every single one of the actors that they are not there for themselves. They are there to bring alive the world of Tolkien and to make his works shine through, not their own personal feelings or opinions on the works. In other words, all the actors seemed rather selfless when it came to this, including everybody behind the scenes making those films. And that's where all the Tolkien fans are gonna go astray with these movies, is it doesn't feel true to his word. There are so many diehard Tolkien fans that love the original Lord of the Rings despite all the changes in the films because they're okay with it. And the reason for that is it's within the spirit of the original writing. The entire purpose of it was to show Tolkien and to not change things for changing things' sake. In fact, Peter Jackson hated all the ghosts in the third movie and wished to remove them, but he didn't because he was doing everything he could to stay true to the book. And that really just goes to show in all of the movies that are made when they're adapted from books. Some are easier than others, that is true, but when it comes down to it, it's the feeling that people are looking for that they got from the books that they want from the film. And when you have no regard for what the writer wanted, when you remake their story into a movie, you're going to lose that feeling and you're going to lose the overall effect that they had in the books that made people love it in the first place. So if you stray from the original writing so much and the original feeling, you are not going to encapsulate all the people that loved your story. Harry Potter is a great example of this. Rowling literally was writing the books and advising the people making the movies while they were making them. It helps to know what's coming in the next books, but the overall feel of what she wanted was there because she was on set to tell these people. Now clearly that wasn't possible with Tolkien, but there are so many works out there. There is so much written down, so many videos and blogs and just so many people talking about Tolkien. If you wanted to know what he was trying to convey, you're gonna find it.
I mean, there's a lot of themes in Tolkien. Friendship. I mean, he was in he was in the First World War. He was in the trenches. He went into World War I with his classmates, you know, his school chums, and by the end of World War I, only two of them were still alive. He saw men die. He saw friendship under fire. He understood what that was like, and Frodo and Sam's relationship is very much based on that. He said he was born 100 years too late, that he would have liked to have lived in England in a pre-industrial age in the early 1800s, before, in the middle of that century, the chimneys and the factories started sort of spreading across the landscape. And a lot of The Lord of the Rings is about that, the destruction of forests and the rise of metal and machines. He hated machines. He said that the most evil creation ever visited on this world was the internal combustion engine. And he hated the idea of people being slaves to the machine. Like when we turn on the TV, the TV is controlling us now. We're slaves to the television. We're slaves to the motor car. The ring in the movie, in the book, the ring is a symbol for the loss of free will. That the ring takes away your free will.